Alan Shepard, the first American in space and the fifth man to walk on the moon, was interviewed for an oral history as part of NASA's Johnson Space Center history collection. Mr. Shepard was one of the Mercury 7 astronauts. This interview was conducted in February of 1998, and Mr. Shepard died of leukemia in July of that year. He's interviewed by Roy Neal, former NBC News correspondent who covered the American space program. This runs about 90 minutes.
We're at the home of Alan and Louise Shepard in Pebble Beach, California. You can't see the magnificent view because we blacked it out so that you have a good tape that can work. And Alan, thank you for letting us be here with you to do this oral history.
It's a pleasure, sir. It's a pleasure.
Let's begin kind of, not at the beginning because there was a beginning before this, but does the date 9 April 1959 mean anything to you?
Well, of course, that was one of the happiest days of my life. That was the day in which we all congregated officially as the U.S. First Astronaut Group. We had been through a selection process, obviously, previous to that time, but that was the day we first showed up officially as the first astronauts of the United States, back at Langley Field, Virginia.
At Langley? Why Langley, I wonder?
Well, of course, NACA had become NASA in a great big hurried turnaround, as you recall, and the program of astronaut selection and training basically was run by the people who worked from Langley. Originally, of course, we all reported into Washington. That was where the initiation, the introduction, the pre-selection, all that sort of routine went on, and then, as you know, we had physicals elsewhere in the country. But once the selection was made, of course, we reported to those people at Langley Field, which was kind of neat for me because I was already stationed in Norfolk in a job which I didn't like in the first place. I was finally taken out of airplanes and put behind a desk for the first time in a bunch of years. But so it was a real easy trip for us. We just didn't even have to move.
Your journey to get there took you through test pilot school, took you through combat experience, took a bit of everything, didn't it? Why was that NASA decided to pick test pilots, of all things, to fly the first space mission?
Well, I think that it was an immediate realization that we had essentially a new product. It didn't look very much like an airplane, but if you were going to put a pilot in, it was going to have to fly somehow like an airplane. And that when you have a brand strange new machine, then you go to the test pilots. That's what they were trained to do, and that's what they had been doing. Now, of course, NACA had some test pilots, but they were a little bit older. None of them, I don't think, were in a position where they probably could have competed with the varied background of test flying, which most of us had. And so the decision was made. And I don't know, they say that Eisenhower had something to do with the decision because he said, well, yeah, we need a test pilot. He agreed to that. NACA, NASA now didn't have very many test pilots, so let's go to the military and see what they have to offer. Now, whether Eisenhower himself was involved in the decision, apparently the White House was to some degree.
But point is, of course, you were named. And when first you sized up those teammates of yours, I wonder what your first reactions were to the group.
Well, I wondered, first of all, where these 6 incompetent guys came from. Seriously. It was not a surprise because several of them had been involved in the preliminary selection process. So I was generally familiar with their background. Glenn, of course, I had known before. Shira I had known before because of our Navy connections. So I knew there was a lot of talent there, and I knew that it was going to be a tough fight to win the prize.
It was competitive at that time between the 7 of you, wasn't it?
Well, it was an interesting situation, because as I say, I was friendly with several of them. And on the other hand, realizing that I was now competing with these guys, so there was always a sense of caution, I suppose, particularly talking about technical things. Now, in the bar, of course, everything changed, but in talking about technical things, there was always a sense of maybe a little bit of reservation, not being totally frank with each other, because there was this very strong sense of competition.
We were talking about your teammates, and I'd kind of like to go back over that. There was competition between the 7 of you, wasn't there?
Well, you know, it was an interesting situation getting together with the 7 originals for the first time. And of course, having known some of them before with the Navy connections, but yet all of a sudden realizing that here was competition. There were 7 guys competing for the first job, or whatever that turned out to be. 7 guys going for that one job. So on the one hand, there was a sense of friendliness and maybe in some support, but on the other hand, hey, I hope the rest of you guys are happy because I'm going to make the first flight.
You were about to move into a whole new world, or a whole new, not non-world, up there in weightless space, of which nothing was known. Didn't that frighten you just a little bit? What were your thoughts about moving into a new environment?
I suspect my thoughts generally reflected those of the other chaps, but with me, I think it had to be the challenge of being able to control a new vehicle in a new environment. This is a generalization, but it's something which I'd been doing for many, many years as a Navy pilot, as a carrier pilot. And believe me, it's a lot harder to land a jet on an aircraft carrier than it is to land a LEM on a moon. And that's a piece of cake, that moon deal. But that was part of my life, was the challenge. And here you had, yes, a new environment, but, you know, for fighter pilots who fly upside down a lot of the time, zero gravity wasn't that big a deal. Now, of course, none of us, being, of course, non-medics, had thought about the long-term effects of zero gravity, but the short-term effects of zero gravity were not the challenge to us. The challenge was to be able to fly an unusual craft and provide good, positive thinking control of that vehicle.
So unusual a craft that there weren't even any training devices or simulators that could simulate the kind of things you were going to do. You had to make them, didn't you?
Well, you know, that's exactly correct. In the early days, we really had what we called part-task trainers instead of simulators. Something was built to indicate the control system. Something else was built to indicate the radio systems or some of the instruments. And they were all sort of separated, not the great glorious simulators which we have today.
What was the role of the astronaut in those devices?
Well, I think that the role of simulators then, today, and tomorrow has to be you're dealing with individuals who fly unusual aircraft, who conduct unusual experiments infrequently, because you don't fly in space every day. So there has to be the simulator which artificially creates problems for you to train against or train with, to learn how to overcome difficulties you may be having with your experiment, difficulties you may be having with the tail of the shuttle or that sort of thing. So simulators are a very, very important part of spaceflight, and they're also a very important part of commercial aircraft. Unfortunately, some of the companies today, the commuter companies, don't require simulator time, which is surprising to me. I think many of the pilots do it on their own, but simulators really are good because they create a sense of confidence in oneself. You go up and the engine quits and you land safely. You go up and the rocket goes sideways and you get out and come back home and do it again. So there's a lot of confidence created in the simulation business.
Did you, the astronauts, take an active role in designing the spacecraft themselves?
Yes, we did. And we tried to do it as efficiently as we could. We assigned, and in the early days, with only 7, we assigned an individual to work directly with the contractor. And this was all with NASA's blessing because the NASA engineers were there as well. But primarily from a pilot's point of view, is this handle in the right place? If you have a switch which you have to use to counteract an emergency, is it reachable, is it visible, or do you have to go behind your back somewhere to find the darn thing? Primarily, from a pilot's point of view, was our interface.
Then, finally, you wound up being the first man to fly in a Mercury spacecraft. Did you know that was coming, or was it a surprise? Can you describe your steps that led up to it?
We'd been in training for probably 20 months or so, toward the end of 1960, early 61, when we all intuitively felt that pretty soon Bob Giroth had to make a decision as to who was going to make the first flight. And when we received word that Bob wanted to see us at 5 in the afternoon one day in our office, sort of felt that perhaps he had decided. There were 7 of us then in one office. We had 7 desks around in the hangar in Langley Field. And Bob walked in, closed the door, and was very matter of fact. He said, well, you know, we've got to decide who's going to make the first flight, and I don't want to pinpoint publicly at this stage one individual. Within the organization, I want everyone to know that we will designate the first flight and the second flight and a backup pilot. But beyond that, we won't make any public decisions. So he said, Shepard gets the first flight, Grissom gets the second flight, and Glenn is the backup for both of these 2 suborbital missions. Any questions? Absolute silence. He said, thank you very much, good luck, turned around and left the room. Well, there I am, looking at 6 faces looking at me, and feeling, of course, totally elated that I had won the competition, but yet almost immediately afterwards feeling sorry for my buddies, because there they were. I mean, they were trying just as hard as I was, and it was a very poignant moment because they all came over, shook my hand, and pretty soon I was the only guy left in the room.
That's a priceless story, Alan. Finally, things progressed to the point where you're getting ready for the whole flight. And if I'm remembering correctly, there were some holds dealing with that day on the launch pad. Let's go back to that day as you remember it. You're getting ready now for MR3, as it was loosely labeled.
Yeah, actually the checkout, the countdown had been going very, very well. Of course, Glenn was the backup pilot, and he'd been in on the pre-flight stuff. The Redstone checked out well. We had virtually no problems at all, and we're scheduled for, I believe it was the 2nd of May. And I was dressed, just about going out the door when there was a tremendous thunderstorm came over, and obviously they decided to cancel it, which I was pleased they did. It was rescheduled 3 days later, and of course went through the same routine. The weather was good, and I remember driving down to the launching pad in a van, which was capable of, providing a comfort for us, and with the pressure suit on, and any last-minute adjustments and temperature devices and so on that had to be made. They were all equipped to do that. The doctor, Bill Douglas, was in there. We pulled up in front of the launch pad. Of course, it was dark. The liquid oxygen was venting out from the redstone. Searchlights all over the place. And I remember saying to myself, well, I'm not going to see this redstone again. And pilots love to go out and kick the tires. And it was sort of like reaching out and kicking the tires on the redstone. Because I stopped and looked at it, looked back and up at this beautiful rocket, and thought, well, okay, Buster, let's go and get the job done. So I sort of stopped and kicked the tires, then went on in and on with the countdown. There was a time during the countdown when there was a problem with the inverter in the redstone. Gordon Cooper was the voice communicator in the blockhouse. So he called and said that the inverter is not working in the redstone. They're going to pull the gantry back in, and we're going to change inverter. It's probably going to take about an hour and a half. And I said, well, if that's the case, then I would like to get out and relieve myself. We had been working with a device to collect urine during the flight that really worked pretty well in zero gravity, but it really didn't work very well when you're lying on your back with your feet up in the air like you were on the redstone. And I thought, well, my bladder was getting a little full, and if I had some time, I'd like to relieve myself. So I said, Gordon, would you check and see if I could get out and relieve myself quickly while they're fixing the... And Gordon came back in about, I guess there was some discussions going on outside. It took about 3 or 4 minutes, and finally came back and said, no, he says, Van Braun says the astronaut will stay in the nose cone. So I thought, well, all right, that's fine, but I'm going to go to the bathroom. And they said, well, you can't do that because you've got wires all over your body and have short circuits. I said, don't you guys have a switch that turns off those wires? And they said, yeah, well, yeah. So I said, please turn the switch off. Well, I relieved myself, and of course, with a cotton undergarment, which we had on, it soaked up immediately in the undergarment, and with 100% oxygen flowing through that spacecraft, I was totally dry by the time we launched. But somebody did say something about being the world's first wetback in space.
At that time, the whole game was totally competitive, not alone among the 7 astronauts, but you were in a race for space with the Russians. Mm. And they kind of beat you to the punch, didn't they? Thinking Yuri Gagarin when I say that.
Yeah, and that little race between Gagarin and me was really, really close. Obviously, their objectives, their capabilities for orbital flight were greater than ours at that particular point. We eventually caught up and went past them, but as you point out, it was the Cold War, there was the competition. We had flown a chimpanzee called Ham in a Redstone-Mercury combination, and everything had worked perfectly, except there was a relay which, at the end of the powered flight, was supposed to eject the escape tower because it was no longer needed, separate it from the Mercury capsule, and eject it. For some reason, with the Ham's flight, it fired, but it did not separate itself. So the chimp was lifted to another 10 or 15 miles in altitude, another 20 or 30 miles in range. There was absolutely nothing wrong with anything else wrong with the mission. So our recommendation strongly was, okay, let's put Shepard in the next one. Everything worked fine. So if the thing happens again, no big deal. Shepard goes a little higher. Werner said no. He said, we want everything absolutely right. So we flew another unmanned mission before Gagarin flew, then his flight, and then mine. So it was really touch and go there. If we'd put me in that unmanned mission, then we would have actually flown first. But it was tight.
In retrospect, it doesn't seem that important, but at the time, I guess it was.
Oh, very important. Absolutely. Absolutely.
How important was it? Did you say anything publicly, or did you just nurse your wounds and get ready to fly?
Oh, no. As you know, we had a lot of differences of opinion about things in the program. Not only the design, but some of the scheduling. But most of that was kept pretty quiet. And most of it was resolved, and very little of that came out in public. It was always sort of a joint decision.
Then, as time went on, you started lobbying for another flight in Mercury, but then Mercury was cut a little short because there was the pressure of something else, wasn't there? Can you discuss those pressures?
You are not surprised that I wanted to fly again, are you?
Not at all.
Mr. Neal?
Not at all,
Okay.
Mr. Shepard. Admiral Shepard, if you will. No, as a
matter of fact, we had after Cooper finished his day and a half orbital mission, there was another spacecraft ready to go. And my thought was to put me up there and just let me stay until something ran out, until the batteries ran down, or until the oxygen ran out, or till we lost the control system or something, then just sort of open-ended kind of a mission. And so I recommended that, and they said that they didn't expect to hear anything else from me. But I remember when Cooper and his family and the other astronauts and families were invited to the White House for cocktails with Jack Kennedy. And we stopped at Jim Webb's house first and had a little warm-up there. And I was politicking with Webb, and I said, you know, Mr. Webb, we could put this baby up there in just a matter of a few weeks. I mean, it's all ready to go. I have the rockets. And just let me sit up there and, see how long it'll last. Get another record out of it. Well, he said, no, I don't. He said, I really don't think so. I think we've got to get on with Gemini. And I said, well, I'm going to see the president in a little while. You mind if I mention it to him? He said, no, but you tell him my side of the story, too. So I said, all right. So we get over there and we're all sipping our booze and let's get some of our taxpayers' money back drinking at the White House. And I got Kennedy aside and I said, there's a possibility we could make another long duration Mercury flight, maybe 2, maybe 3 days. And we'd like to do that. He said, well, what does Mr. Webb think about it? And I said, Webb doesn't want to do it. He said, well, he said, I think I'll have to go along with Mr. Webb.
Made you realize the power, didn't the power behind the throne.
At least I tried.
Yeah. So instead, you started then getting ready to fly in Gemini. Another whole new ball game.
Yeah.
But that
yes,
was when...
it was very fortunate, of course, that I was chosen to make the first Gemini mission. Tom Stafford, who is a very bright young guy, was assigned as co-pilot, and we were already into the mission, already training for the mission. We had been in the simulators, as a matter of fact, several different times. I'm not sure whether we'd looked at the hardware in St. Louis or not prior to the problem which I had. The problem I had was a disease called Meniere's. It is due to elevated fluid pressure in the inner ear. And they tell me it happens in people who are type A, hyper, driven, whatever. Unfortunately, what happens is it causes a lack of balance, it causes dizziness, in some cases nausea, as a result of all of this disorientation going on up there in the ear. It, fortunately, it's unilateral. This was only happening with me in the left side. But it was so obvious that NASA grounded me right away. And they assigned another crew for first Gemini flight. So there I was. What do I do now? Do I go back to the Navy? Do I stick around with the space program? What do I do? I finally decided that I would stay with NASA and see if there wasn't some way that we could correct this ear problem. Several years went by. There was some medication which alleviated it, but I still couldn't fly solo. Can you imagine? The world's greatest test pilot has to have some young guy in the back flying along with you. I mean, talk about embarrassing situations. But as a matter of fact, it was Stafford, it was Tom Stafford who came to me, said he had a friend in Los Angeles who was experimenting correcting this Meniere's problem surgically. And so I said, gosh, that's great, I'll go out and see him. So we set it up. I went on out there. The fellow said, yeah, we do. What we do is we make a little opening there and put a tube in so that it enlarges the chamber that takes that fluid pressure, and in some cases it's worked. And I said, well, what if it doesn't work? And he said, well, you won't be any worse off than you are, except you might lose your hearing, but other than that. So I went out there under an assumed name.
What was the name?
Oh, it was Polis, I think, Victor Polis. And the doctor knew and the nurse knew, but nobody else knew that. And so Victor Polis checks in, and they run the operation, run the surgery. And it's not that traumatic, obviously, because after about a day I was out of there. Of course, it was obvious when you look at the big ball of stuff over my ear when I got back home. But NASA started looking at me, and several months went by, and finally said, yes, all the tests show that you're no longer affected by this Meniere's disease. So there I was, having made the right decision.
I think we better backtrack a little here, because obviously this is going to bring you into direct discussion about a fellow named Deke Slayton. And we haven't established the fact that Deke, like you, was knocked out of flying. So let's go back over a little of that, particularly because that happened back in the Mercury days when Deke was getting ready to fly. And I wonder, when you first heard...
Yeah, Deke had already been assigned to follow John.
Mm-hmm.
Right.
And suddenly he got bumped from his Mercury flight. That was a heart condition, wasn't it?
Yeah. There was a lot of controversy about that, because it was a heart murmur or a palpitation, some irregularity, but one which was not obvious. I mean, it was not a continuous kind of thing. It was not as if he was, getting ready for cardiac arrest or anything like that. It was just occasionally he'd have a little twitch down there.
It was a real blow. I wonder what your reaction was to it at the time, and if you can give us a little background on it.
Well, back in those days, as we have discussed before, we were still highly competitive. There were still 7 guys going for whatever flight was available next. And Slayton had been chosen to make the second orbital mission after Glenn, when he had this little heart murmur. As I say, it wasn't anything real noticeable. I mean, it wasn't continuous. It just showed up once in a while. But yet it made the medics very nervous. And even after fairly exhaustive tests showed that it was not repetitive to the point where it would have interfered with the mission, there was still a sense of, well, we just can't take a chance on anything, on the hardware or the astronauts. So he was grounded, flat grounded. And at that point, the feeling of competitiveness with Deke turned into one of camaraderie, one of feeling sorry for him, a sense of, well, let's get you back on the schedule, old buddy, somehow, because you really felt sorry for him at that point, because he no longer was competitive. But on the other hand, to have a guy in that position, in knowing how tough that could be to him. So he was grounded. Obviously, the benefit for us was to have some one of us who could immediately become a spokesman, because he had decided to stay on. I think he'd resigned his Air Force Reserve at that point. Not sure, but I think so. Anyway, somebody who could speak for the group and not, have to worry about some of the ins and outs of training. So it was an obvious advantage having him as a leader and as a spokesman of the group.
And so he became, what, chief of the astronaut office? What was his title?
Well, I think, yeah, sort of chief of the astronaut office.
Mm-hmm. That was a job that eventually you wound up with by title.
Yeah, well, things were changed around, of course.
Yeah, but once you went into Gemini, all of a sudden, there were 2 of the 7 that had been grounded.
Yeah.
Deke and Al, what a team. How did it come about that you wound up becoming chief of the astronaut office, while Deke, by this time, had assumed quite some power as head of astronaut affairs?
Well, as I'd indicated earlier, I had decided to fight this many years to stay with NASA. And during the time period when I was grounded, I could become very, very useful in the astronaut training business. And I suppose that we really had grown, if you consider the number of chaps that were involved in the simulators, for example, in the suiting procedures, taking care of the suits and so on, direct supporting facilities for the astronauts. There are really quite a number of people involved, so they decided to make it a separate division. Deke was the head of that division, and I was given the job specifically of the care and feeding of these astronauts, charge of their training, helping Deke with crew assignments, that sort of thing.
Was it Deke primarily that got you the job, or was it just the fact that you had all the qualifications? How did that work?
Well, I think it was just a matter of saying, what do we need? When I became grounded and informed NASA that I was going to stay there, then we had 2 guys that really could have, either one of us could have done the job. One little difference, I think, perhaps, that I knew I was going to somehow, something was going to happen soon with me. I was either going to get the ear fixed or I was gone. With Deke, I think that he was more or less resigned at that stage to the heart murmur business, and the medics would keep giving him a bad time about that. So I think it was really that Deke probably was in more of a long-term commitment than in my particular case. So I think that's really why, really over and on what we established. And we just talked it over with Kraft and Gilruth, and they sort of agreed that was a good selection. So
You two had quite a reputation for running a very tight ship.
well, of course, Deke and I were both mad because we were grounded. We'd both been training as astronauts. We knew where every skeleton was in the whole process. And we just wouldn't let those guys get away with anything. I mean, we knew what they had to do. We knew how they had to do it. And if they weren't doing it, then we would bring them in and tell them about it. Maybe I was a little more forceful than I would have been normally, because being grounded, I believe they called me the icy commander or some friendly term like that. But
Steely-eyed.
oh yeah, we knew where all the skeletons were.
And knowing that, in a very peculiar way, from a NASA point of view, perhaps it was for the betterment of the space program that you and Deke both were doing what you were doing at the time you were doing it. Did you ever think of that?
Well, I think certainly there was a need for coordination. There was need for representation at executive level. Other chaps could have done the job perhaps equally as well, or perhaps even better. But it seemed like we turned out some pretty good crews.
I don't think anybody could fault your selection of crews, Alan. All the way through the Gemini program and finally on into Apollo. And it was during the time of Apollo, by which time you had finally located, through Stafford's ministrations, as you described earlier, a way to treat the Meniere syndrome in Los Angeles. And suddenly, the skies opened again for Alan Shepard. Or did they? You had to get back into the program, didn't you?
Well, of course, when NASA finally said I could fly again, I went to Deke and said, "We have not announced publicly the crew assignment for Apollo 13. I have a recommendation to make." And I had picked two bright young guys, one of them a PhD and one of them a heck of a lot smarter than I was, and made up a team to go to for an Apollo flight. And I said, I would like to recommend that I get Apollo 13 with Stu Russo as command module and Ed Mitchell as lunar pilot. Zeke said, I don't know, let's try it out. So we sent it to Washington, and they said, no way. I said, wait a minute, now Shepard's got to be at least as smart as the rest of these guys, maybe a little smarter. And they said, well, we know that, but it's a real public relations problem. Here this guy has just gotten ungrounded, and all of a sudden, boom, he gets premier flight assignment. So the discussion went on for several days, and finally they said, all right, we'll make a deal. We'll let Shepard have Apollo 14. Give us another crew for Apollo 13. And so that's what happened.
Oh, and did it ever? Because suddenly Apollo 13, on its way to the moon, ran into huge problems. I wonder what you thought when the problem developed, and what did you do during that time period?
Well, of course, the immediate thought was, how do we get these guys back? Obviously, right from the start, it was the end of a landing mission. No question about that. But it was interesting to see the entire system being flushed out, being made to come back with any kind of a recommendation. And of course, Chris Kraft and Gene Kranz were the guys that held everybody together on this thing and said, look, we've got to find a way to bring these boys back. Failure is not an option. And as you well know, the whole system was vibrating. In any corner of the manufacturing processes, the vendoring processes, NASA's people. Everybody was working toward a solution for this problem. And as it turned out, it was more than one solution. I mean, there are several different areas of engineering had to be addressed and corrected. And I think that it's probably NASA's finest hour when you think about it. I think that certainly from a pilot's point of view, it was just as an important event as stepping on the moon on Apollo 11.
You had the next flight. Did you approach it with fear, trepidation, or did you approach it with the knowledge that you probably were going to make a pretty good flight out of it, thanks to what had been learned from Apollo 13? Which way was it?
Well, I think that people have, I know people have expressed the opinion that it might have been a little bit more dangerous to fly on Apollo 14 than it would have been had there not been Apollo 13. But recognize that almost a total redesign had to be done. Well, not necessarily redesign, but a total reassessment of the package had to be done to find out specifically why the thing blew and to fix that, to look for similar situations throughout the service module, but again to reassess the whole scheme of things. You know, in missions like that where you're in basic research, there are always decisions along the way that, well, maybe we should fix this particular piece of equipment because the chances it might fail are 1 out of 100. On the other hand, it's only a small part of a huge process scheduled to go at a certain time. And if this fails, we have the crew to back up. There's always these little decisions we made. So obviously part of the assessment process of Apollo 13 had to be to go over those decisions again. Now did we have the time to make some corrections of these 1 in 100 chances of failure? And of course several were made in addition to the corrections of the basic problem. So there's a feeling of security, and we obviously were part of the process.
By that time, too, I had forgotten you had been through the trauma of Apollo 1 and the fire and the redesign that occasioned. Let's go back over that for a moment or two.
Yeah, talk about feelings, yeah.
Because that must have been a tough one.
Well, of course, Apollo 1 came as a real shock, no question about it. It came as a shock because it was unexpected, and I'll get into the reasons for it being unexpected a little bit later. But to lose a crew in a ground test, I mean, they're still sitting there on the ground. To lose a crew really woke everybody up. And that was important because all of us, every single one of us, and Deke and I discussed this, unfortunately after the fact, but we were a part of a group that had gone through Mercury, had gone through Gemini. We're leading, we're beating the Russians. Nothing can go wrong. And it led to a sense of false security, no question about it. Deke and I remember talking about, Gus would come back and he had a complaint about this. He said, this is the worst spacecraft I've ever seen, and complained about that. And of course he was complaining to engineers as well as to Deke and to me. But Deke and I insidiously became part of the problem because we said, okay, Gus, go ahead and make a list of this stuff and we'll see that it's fixed by the time you fly. Not that we'll see that it's fixed before they stick you back in there for a test where you're using 100% oxygen. See, there was that sense of security, a sense of complacency that everyone had, including myself and including Deke. I think some people felt that sense of responsibility and neglect, bad decisions more than others, and were personally affected by it more than others. But I don't believe there are more than just a few hardheads that didn't feel in the long run that they were part of the problem.
As it worked out, perhaps because of Apollo 1, Apollo went on to be a hugely successful series of flights.
I don't think there's any question about the fact that the Apollo 1 fire did shape up the whole system, did make people realize that they had been too complacent, that they were overconfident, and it resulted, of course, in the total redesign of many of the parts of the spacecraft, and I'm sure contributed to what was a very highly successful. You know, we're still basic research. You're still putting people on the moon, and you do it 6 times, and you only miss once. I mean, that's incredible.
And the one time you got the people back. Well, let's go back in time a little bit more to some of the older history, because you were really there when the flight to the moon was born. Wasn't that right? About the time following your first very successful suborbital mission? Tell us about it.
Well, you know, it's an interesting thought, and I've heard it expressed a few times, and that is that the decision Jack Kennedy made to go to the moon was made after we only had 15 minutes of total spaceflight time. And a lot of people chuckle and say, sure. But the fact of the matter is that that is true. And this is how it happened. We were invited back to Washington after the mission, and I got a nice little medal from the president, and which, by the way, he dropped. I don't know whether you remember that scene or not, but
Vividly.
but Jimmy Webb had the thing in a box, and it had been loosened from its little clip, and so as the president made a speech and said, "I now present you the medal," and he turned around and Webb leaned forward, and the thing slid off the box and went to the deck, and Kennedy and I both bent over for it. We almost banged heads. Kennedy made it first, Jack made it first, and he said in his damn Yankee accent, he went up and says, "Here, Shepard, I give you this medal that comes from the ground up." And then Jackie's sitting there, she's mortified. She said, "Jack, pin it on him, pin it on him." So he then recovered to the point where he pinned the medal on, and everything was fine. And we had a big laugh out of that. But originally, Louise and I were supposed to proceed to the Congress after the White House ceremony, and then have a reception and leave town. But Jack said, "No, I want you to come back to the White House, have a meeting, and let's talk about your flight." So we had the reception at the Hill, drove back in the Oval Office. There were the heads of NASA there, and the heads of the government. Jack, of course, was there. Lyndon Johnson was there, and there's a picture of me sitting on the sofa. Jack is in a rocking chair, and I'm telling him how I was flying the spacecraft, and he's leaning forward, listening intently to this thing. We talked about the details of the flight, specifically how man had responded and reacted to being able to work in space environment. And toward the end of the conversation, he said to the NASA people, "What are we doing next? What are our plans?" And they said, "Well, there was a couple of guys over in the corner talking about maybe going to the moon." He said, "I want a briefing." Just 3 weeks after that mission, 15 minutes of space is when Kennedy made his announcement. Folks, we are going to the moon, and we're going to do it within this decade. After 15 minutes of space time. Now, you don't think he was excited? You don't think he was a space cadet? Absolutely. Absolutely. People say, well, he made the announcement because he had problems with the Bay of Pigs. His popularity was going down. Not true. Not true. When Glenn finished his mission, Glenn, Grissom, and I flew with Jack back from West Palm to Washington for Glenn's ceremony. The four of us sat in his cabin, and we talked about what Gus had done. We talked about what John had done. We talked about what I had done, all the way back. People would come in with papers to be signed. He said, don't worry, we'll get those when we get back to Washington. The entire flight, I tell you, he was really a space cadet, and it's too bad he could not have lived to see his promise.
When he first made that announcement, what was your personal reaction?
Oh, we were delighted. We were delighted, but there was a little bit of a gulp in there because he put a time cap on the deal. I don't think that any of us thought that we would be able to make it within, that was 1961, within 8.5 years. But anyway, delighted, but a little bit of, well, maybe the president is a little enthusiastic.
Well, we finally got up to that point where we were into Apollo, and what was your choice, you and Deke, what was your best bet as to which would be the first flight to make a manned landing on the moon?
Well, I suppose that we felt the schedule as it was laid out after we rescheduled the Apollo 8 mission. I think that we felt that the missions 9 and 10 adequately demonstrated the lunar module's capabilities, that we really deep down inside felt that we could make it. We could have very good possibility of making it on the first try.
And of course you did.
Of course we did.
And then along came 14. We were just at about that point, I think, when we changed tapes a while back. Because now you had picked your team, and you had sweat out Apollo 13, and you were ready to fly. Must have been a big moment when you were ready, waiting for takeoff.
Well, I think that as in retrospect, the obvious advantage here was that Apollo 13 gave us more time to train, no question about it. Not that we would not have had enough, but it gave us a little higher level of comfort with that extra training time. I think obviously the changes to the spacecraft were good ones. Not only the changes which related directly to the explosion, but others that were made as well. There was a lot of confidence. As I said, I picked a couple of bright guys to go along with me, and there was really a lot of confidence. Gene Cernan, of course, was my backup. It's a funny story about Cernan. We were at the point, I think we were approximately 4 or 5 days away from liftoff, scheduled liftoff. We were all in quarantine, of course, at the Cape, and that time we had to do 21 days before, 21 days after routine because of the bug stuff. And Cernan was out early in the morning flying helicopter because the commanders used helicopters to train. And, you know, the last few hundred feet of the landing. And we were having breakfast, and we knew Gene was out flying a helicopter, and all of a sudden the door opens, and in walks Cernan. He is absolutely covered with soot. He's got scars on his face. We said, Cernan, what happened? He had been flying the helicopter over the river, which was absolutely calm, that early in the morning, like a mirror, and he had been distracted by something or other, because he was looking at the land instead of the water, and he flew that helicopter right into the water, nosed over, blades all over the place, tail rotor blades all over the place, fire, because the tanks, the gas tanks, or saddle tanks on that dinky little chopper, they split and there was fuel all over the place. Cernan is going down like this, and of course, being a good Navy trained pilot, he knew how to cope with being underwater, so he got out and he swam to the top and realized he was in fire, so he splashed around like this and took a big deep breath and swam a while and came up and splashed around some more and swam a while. Finally got out of the smoke and flames and all that stuff. Somebody had seen the crash, obviously, and of course the Banana River, isn't that big a deal. But he came on the shore, came out, and there he was, and just totally bedraggled. So he looks at me as my backup pilot and said, "Okay, Shepard, you win. You get to go."
Alan, you're now on the moon. You've gotten there on Apollo 14. And I wonder what your feelings were at the moment.
Let me tell you the story about how I got there.
Oh, yes, of course.
Well, actually, the flight had gone extremely well. We'd had one or two problems, docking problem earlier, problem with something floating around in the abort switch, which closed, made as if we were pushing the abort switch closed, but all these were taken care of. Now we're on the way down, flying up on our backs like this, with the engine pointing that way, slowing down, getting gradually more steeper and more steeper. We had a ruling that the computer had to be updated by the landing radar. Reason being is that while you're on your back, obviously you can't see the ground, you can't see the mountains, you can't see the rocks or anything. So we had a rule that said if the landing radar is not updating the computer by the time that you're down at a level of about 13,000 feet, then you have to abort. You have to get out of there. Well, the landing radar wasn't working. And so they called us up and said, "Your landing radar is not working." We said, "Thank you very much. We were aware of that." And then a little bit further on, and they said, "You know what the ground rule is about aborting if you're not at 13,000 feet." Well, yeah, we knew that. Finally, some bright young man over in the corner said, "Hey, the landing radar is working, but it's locked up on infinity. Have them pull a switch, reset it, see if it works." So we pulled the circuit breaker, put it back in, and sure enough, the landing radar came in. And shortly after that, we got cleared to land, and it's sort of a, man, that was close kind of routine. As soon as we pitched over, there was beautiful Prom Harbor, just the way I had seen it hundreds of times from the scale model. Came on down, made a very, very soft landing. As a matter of fact, soft enough so that even though we landed in a slight crater like this, the uphill leg didn't crush like it's supposed to. We had crushable material on the landing. So, instead of a slight right wing down, perfect landing, shutting off the switches, and Ed Mitchell turned to me and said, "Alan, what were you going to do if the landing radar had not been working by 13,000 feet?" I looked at him and I said, "Ed, you'll never know."
Well, there you were.
I would have gone down.
Of course.
Oh, yeah.
That's the truth.
Not have come that far. Well, you see, Ed, for example, had not been in a landing simulator at all. It was my job to land. And I'd done hundreds of these things. I knew that if I could see the surface, man, I could get down, maybe not exactly where we were supposed to, but I could get down close to it.
And so you would have made the landing under any circumstances. You'd have busted a mission rule.
I would have at least at least been able to take a visual look. I would have pitched over and taken a visual look and then made a decision.
Fair enough. Well, we finally have you on the moon. Mission accomplished. Or was it? Tell me about what you and Ed did on the moon as you remember it. What were the highlights?
Well, it's, of course, the first feeling was one of a tremendous sense of accomplishment, I guess, if you will. Tremendous sense of realizing that, hey, not too long ago I was grounded. Now I'm on the moon. There was that sense of self-satisfaction, I think, immediately. But then that went away because we had a lot of work to do. But I'll never forget that moment. Another moment which I will never forget is after Ed had followed me down and we had set out some of our equipment, taken the emergency samples, we had a few moments to look around, to look up in the black sky, totally black sky, even though the sun is shining on the surface. It's not reflected. There's no diffusion, no reflection. Totally black sky and seeing another planet, planet Earth. Now, planet Earth is only 4 times as large as the moon. So you can really still put your thumb and your forefinger around it at that distance. So it makes it look beautiful. It makes it look lonely. It makes it look fragile. You think to yourself, just imagine the millions of people that are living on that planet and don't realize how fragile it is. I think this is a feeling everyone has had and expressed it in one fashion or another. But that was an overwhelming feeling, and seeing the beauty of the planet on the one hand, but the fragility of it on the other.
Being Alan Shepard, of course, shortly after that golden moment, you decided to play a little golf.
So, I didn't decide to play a little golf. Oh, that is a long story. I will not tell the whole story.
Well, tell us what you think might be. All right. Because it is a very famous story, and I'm sure a lot of people would like to hear your version of it.
Well, as you know, so far I'm the only person to have hit a golf ball on the moon. Probably will be for some time. And being a golfer, I was intrigued before the flight by the fact that the ball with the same club head speed will go 6 times as far. Its time of flight, I won't say stay in the air because there's no air, its time of flight will be at least 6 times as long. It will not curve because there's no atmosphere to make it slice or hook. And I thought, what a neat place to whack a golf ball. Well, when I went to Bob Gilruth to tell him I wanted to hit a couple of golf balls, of course, absolutely no way. And there was a series when I explained that it was not a regular golf club. It was the handle that we used that we pulled out, put a scoop on the end to scoop up samples of dust with. And that was already up there, would be thrown away. Then we had a club head, which I had adapted to snap on this handle, and 2 golf balls, for which I paid, the 2 golf balls and the club head, no expense to the taxpayer. Okay. The thing that finally convinced Bob was, I said, boss, I'll make a deal with you. If we have screwed up, if we have had equipment failure, anything has gone wrong on the surface, where you are embarrassed or we are embarrassed, I will not do it. I will not be so frivolous. And I want to wait until the very end of the mission, stand in front of the television camera, whack these golf balls with this makeshift club, fold it up, stick it in my pocket, climb up the ladder, close the door, and we're gone. So he finally said, okay. And that's the way it happened.
In full view of a huge worldwide audience of millions of people who have never forgotten it to this day. Alan Shepard still is perhaps best known as the guy who played golf on the moon.
Well, it was designed to be a fun thing. Fortunately, it is still a fun thing. The club, the makeshift club, is with the U.S. Golf Association in their museum. There has been absolutely no commercialism tried. Well, there's been absolutely no commercialism. One company tried to say it was their golf ball, and we cut them off very quickly. So it's been just a totally fun thing.
And still is.
Yeah.
Now, some general questions, if we may, because, well, I guess maybe we better get you back from the moon. Can't just leave you up there. You played golf, now you've closed the hatch, and you came back. And after that, it wasn't too long thereafter that you finally decided you'd completed your run with NASA. You moved on to other fields.
Well, as you recall, of course, the only scheduled missions were the Skylab missions. The crews were already assigned. The Soviet joint mission with the Soviets, crews were already assigned.
Including your friend.
So it's going to be a long time.
Deke finally got his shot at it, didn't he?
Boy, we were so pleased. We were so pleased. Bless his heart. Can you imagine having to learn to speak Russian to go into space? I mean, that is above and beyond the call of duty. But he did it. I'm not sure the Russians understood him, but but he did it. We were really so pleased and so happy for him.
I'm remembering you were with me on television because you were doing a job as a consultant and on-the-air talent when the landing was accomplished, and we were thinking, my, Deke and Brand, they all look just great. Stafford, they all look great. Little did we know they had been dosed with nitric acid, was it? Do you remember after the fact they had caught, they had inhaled something or another?
Kind of vapors, yeah.
Yeah, some vapors from the from the ejection system, and they were in kind of bad shape for a short while.
Yeah, I've forgotten whether there was a leak or what happened on that deal.
Well,
You'll have to look that up.
We'll look that up. We'll forget it now because obviously it's unimportant. That's their flight, their stuff. Anyway, okay. General thoughts then. John Glenn is about to fly again, and you and he are pretty close to the same age. I wonder what your thoughts are about John flying.
Well, John's a couple of years older than I am. I believe he's 77. But I've been saying for years that the taxpayers didn't get their money's worth out of Glenn because he made one flight and immediately went into the Congress. And as a taxpayer, I objected to that. I've been telling John this for years and years. I called him up the other day after the announcement and I said, John, I'm glad that you're going to give me one more flight for my tax dollars. I think it's good, quite frankly. Obviously, there are a lot of things about how weightlessness treats individuals, and the person's reaction to weightlessness is, of course, a function of the amount of exercise or lack thereof, general physical conditioning, and the kind of things that one really needs to know if you're going to be in a long-term mission. The more you find out, the better shape you'll be in. So he's a good data point. He thinks he's in pretty good shape, and he probably is, but his bones are still more brittle, obviously, and I'm sure that there will be some lessons learned even during that short period of time, looking at his general physical conditions before and after. I think it's a good thing. I think we'll learn something from it.
Do you think you'd like to fly again?
Oh, of course I would. Of course I would. Unfortunately, I'm not in top health at the moment.
Oh, that's just a subject of time.
Yeah.
You've talked some here about NASA managers, but I'd kind of like to run down a little list with you and get some evaluation from you about some of these people we've been talking about. For example, Jim Webb.
Well, you know, it was interesting being involved with the old NACA and then the NASA during the formation periods, because NACA obviously was a group of engineers, basically. They didn't have a political type administrator. But when Webb came along, I mean, what a fresh breath he was. He knew all the ins and outs of Washington. He knew which chords to play. And not that he was a lobbyist by any sense of the imagination. He didn't have to be. He had a great package. Men in space. And he played it well. He really did. He did us a great favor, certainly responding so quickly and so rapidly to Kennedy's really surprising decision to go to the moon. He did a good job. Jim did a good job. But as I said before, you know, I came to him with a technical request. Got turned down, so at least, you know, he had some engineering knowledge there somewhere.
Well, speaking of engineering knowledge, let's take Bob Gilruth.
Oh, I liked Bob. I really did. Because Bob had been in the aviation business forever. And being right there at Langley, seeing him, not every day, but seeing him frequently, and talking to people who'd been with him the old NACA days and what he had done. I mean, just a remarkable, remarkable gentleman. And I think that he was really sort of a hands-on kind of guy, too. I obviously appreciate his decision to let me make the first flight, but he never told me why he made that decision the way he did. I have asked him several times over the years, and he has always said, well, you were just the right man at the right time. But I'm sure that he was very personally involved in that selection process. There were some suggestions from some of the other folks in the program that maybe he had made a mistake in the decision, that there might have been someone else who qualified better, but he did not change his mind. So he's one of my heroes.
How about Chris Kraft?
I like Chris. You know, I guess we were really closer in the early days when he was the flight director and we were all in that little building down there at the Cape. And I think I felt perhaps closer to him then, but you could see the decision-making process that he went through. And you knew that he was not making any sloppy decisions, that they'd been very well thought through.
George Lowe.
I didn't really know George that well. Never really worked directly with him, as you know. That particular stage in the game, George came along later, and actually Dietz worked with him more than I did.
How about Werner von Braun?
Well, Werner was an interesting guy. We never were together too much. But I do remember, and as I'm sure the rest of the original seven, we had dinner at his house one night with him and Eberhard Reese, and then we drove out to a little hillside where they'd built their own observatory. And we took a look at the moon through a telescope, which was, here you are with a great rocket scientist, and he's showing you what the moon looks like through a telescope.
You know, it seems strange that to the public at large, Bob Gilruth is kind of lost in limbo, and Werner von Braun stands in mind as one of the prime movers. Wonder what your reaction would be to that evaluation.
I think that's true. I think that's true. I think that Gilruth's entire life had been and was dedicated to aviation and space. And he basically was an engineer. I think that perhaps von Braun obviously was an engineer, but I think von Braun had been involved in political aspects over in Germany where maybe it was a matter of survival. And I think he dealt with the public more easily than Gilruth did. It came more naturally to him. And as a result, I think that in the final analysis, the general public knew more about von Braun than they did about Gilruth. But those of us on the inside, particularly the manned space aspect of it, I think owe a lot more to Gilruth than we do to Werner.
Don't you think part of that is the fact that Werner always was a salesman of ideas, that he was really out selling the concept of the lunar missions?
Well, I think so. I think he really almost felt that he had to. Maybe he felt the same way we did. Yes, it was a great idea, but he might have been concerned a little bit with the pressure of the schedule. That may have been the reason. I don't know.
Here's one that comes right out of the gang at Houston. What are some of the worst things that happened to you after your selection as an astronaut? Some of the worst things that happened.
The worst things? Well, obviously, and this was not a fault of the system, but obviously being grounded was the worst thing that has ever happened to me.
When you were running the astronaut office, what was the most difficult thing that you ran into there? Do you remember anything as being particularly difficult during that time in office?
I think that let me say that while I was head of the astronaut office, that it was my responsibility, the care and feeding of a very enthusiastic, very intelligent, very dedicated, motivated bunch of guys. And there were jealousies in the ranks, people being jealous of so-and-so, particularly being chosen for flight or for backup position or a support crew position. And there were instances where fairly harsh discussions were taken to sort of straighten things out. It said, hey, look, Deke and I are running this program, and this is the way it's going to be run, and we're sorry, but eventually you'll be treated fairly. There were some that still feel they weren't, but small percentage, hopefully.
Looking back on it, what do you think now about the Life magazine contract? Good, bad, or indifferent? You don't have to answer that one if you don't choose to.
Well, I don't know. It's with respect to the contract we had with Life magazine, I think there's a little ambivalence there. At first, it was attractive to us because it provided controlled access to the press, especially on personal things. I mean, personal relationships within the household, personal feelings, the wives, how did you feel about your husband going into space and that sort of thing. None of us had been involved in any of that sort of publicity or recognition before. And in the early days, it got to be a little bothersome, quite frankly. So this, I think at the start, it appeared to be a way to get around that. And so it seemed to be welcome from that point of view. But then the criticism came about the amount of money involved. And so I think all in all, we came out about even. Half the people thought it was a good deal and half the people thought it was a bad deal.
I think somebody in Houston is looking for some information with this next one. Would you change any of NASA's current practices in selecting, training, and assigning space flight crews?
Well, you know, that's a very difficult question for me to answer because I'm not involved in the process anymore. I think one has to look at the flights which are being made, at the performance of the crews, the number of delays because of mechanical problems and that sort of thing. And using these criteria, I would say they're running a good ship. I would say they're running a successful program. There have been obviously no errors which have resulted in loss of life. They have used the crew to correct many problems. Remarkable repair of the Hubble telescope. Of course, that was some years ago, but these are the kind of things which indicate to me that they're doing a pretty good job.
You know, proving what you're saying, I'm thinking now, I can't remember a single case of disaster occasioned by pilot error, which speaks pretty well for the group, doesn't it?
Yeah.
Of course, today they're now into things other than pilots.
Yeah.
You're into the broad gamut of flight crews, women, scientists, payload specialists. It's become...
But when you consider the fact that you're still, well, I suppose if you say you're still doing basic research into the operation of the shuttle as a shell, as a vehicle, that's probably not true anymore. You've probably reached the operational stage.
We're pretty close to it.
Yeah.
Recently, I guess it was the Columbia, it flew its 26th mission, if I remember correctly, for one spacecraft. A remarkable circumstance.
It really is.
Yeah, well, you stopped
So I
to think
guess you could say they're operational, but still it's a remarkable record.
Well, and I've asked an awful lot of questions, both from my own point of view and those in Houston. It seems to me it's high time we let you say anything that you'd like if there's something that we haven't asked that should have been asked. So, if so, fire for effect.
Of course, it's been a great part of my life to be involved in the space program. And even before that, as a Navy test pilot, had some really exciting, satisfying jobs. But I guess I would have to say that it has been a distinct pleasure to be involved in the space program, specifically in being allowed to make a couple of really recognizable, spectacular, lucky missions. But I think that the thing that has impressed me the most about the whole NASA process is that it has worked so well over the years. When you take a look at a group of civilian engineers and scientists that have to work with contractors who are paid and work for somebody else, that also has to work with the military, because you've got military involved, and that things have really turned out remarkably well. Now, there have been some heated discussions between the advantages of manned space flight and unmanned space flight, because there are parts of NASA, as you know, totally dedicated to unmanned space flight. There have been some noted discussions and differences of opinion between the engineers on spaceflight who would like to automate everything and leave the pilots out of there. But you know, in the final analysis, I can't remember any of these decisions that were made with an absolute hard-over judgment. There always seems to me there always has been and still are discussions that are going on to get the best possible answer. I mean, when you take a look at the NASA organization, 1958, 1959, nobody would have thought what it has done over the years. Nobody would have thought that the computers which took us to the moon and back were the forerunners of today's chips and today's technology, because of the money and the effort that NASA spent back in the 60s. Sure, we would have computers, no question about it, but we wouldn't have advanced, we wouldn't be at the position we are today without that tremendous impetus that NASA had in making the computers. Satellites, I mean, incredible data of information flowing back and forth in satellites, all springing from the NASA organization. You know, it's remarkable what the organization has done and is still doing. It's just a great process.
Let the record show that commercial was totally unsolicited. That was Alan Shepard's own thought. I'm just making that for the record. Alan,
You didn't have to apologize.
I'm not apologizing. I'm making sure that somebody watching this knows very well that was pure Alan Shepard, and not Roy Neal instigating a thought or two, or not NASA instigating a thought or two.
They wouldn't accuse you of that, Roy.
No, but this is a NASA tape that we're making, and I just want to make darn sure that the people watching it know that came right out of the blue and was pure you. That's all.
Well, it's the truth.
Well, Alan, thank you very much. It's been a real pleasure.
You think you got enough, huh?
Well, if we don't, we'll let the powers that be tell us that we ought to come back and do it again sometime.
All right.